1968, many took to the streets in France in mass protests, street battles, and nationwide strikes that shattered France. At the time, France was still recovering from World War II. France's was recovery from economic inequalities, government corruption, and limited representation. In the 1950s and 60s, after World War II, France was focused on rebuilding, which was aided under the Marshall Plan, and the economy flourished, as a period known as the Trente Glorieuses, which is directly translated to the Glorious 30 Years. France also began to modernize, and was met with rapid industrialization and urbanization. The inventions from this time transformed traditional ways of life. This did improve living standards for French citizens, but it also created tensions, specifically in rural areas and among workers. At this time, there was also a returning face in power, Charles de Gaulle. He returned to the political power in 1958 and quickly established the Fifth Republic, which centralized executive power. De Gaulle's leadership style was seen as authoritarian and paternalistic. This was an uprising issue, especially to the younger generation in France. The younger generations wanted democratic participation, as well as liberal reforms for their country. At the time, people weren't very favorable to the government. Communist and socialist parties of France, National Assembly, even formed a coalition in an attempt to unseat Charles de Gaulle. What was happening, students took to the streets and barricaded a building in Paris University at Nanterre on March 22, 1968. The aim of these students was to bring justice to previously arrested students who protested at the March of the Vietnam War. The student barricade ended after the students learned that the formerly arrested students were released. These students did not know it, but they had laid the groundwork for what would eventually be known as the Protests of May 1968. The reason for the students of all people to ignite the riots and protest was due to the surge in university students by the 1960s. French universities were overcrowded and rigged, making the students attending more willing to revolt. Students continued to protest with more force than before. Only a few days after the first protest on May 2nd, Nanterre University was shut down after students organized an anti-imperialist protest at the university. The very next day, on the campus closed, but the protest simply moved to Sorbonne in the Latin Quarter. There were attempts by the police to shut these down protests, but their attempt turned violent, resulting in the arrest of 574 people. The police violence and the arrests only furthered the drive for justice, and not only by students but also teachers and like-minded citizens. Just as before, police grew violent. They beat and used tear gas on protesters, trying to contain them. The protesters threw cobblestone at law enforcement. Hundreds were injured and arrested. The cobblestone thrown that was known as Les Paves, which became a symbol of revolution. The riots gained attention. And on May 7th, 30,000 students marched on Champs-Élysées, a known avenue in Paris to this day. And the night of May 10th, cars were burned in order to disperse rioters, and the left bank was collateral damage. In the 48-hour violent cry for justice, the movement was recognized nationally, and more attention meant more followers. Workers were the next to join the revolution, specifically factory workers. On May 13th, barricaded their place of work. Unions called for a single day of protest, but workers did not comply. They continued to protest. Workers were in search of higher pay and removal of Charles de Gaulle from the government. The numbers of people going against the government made it impossible for leaders to do anything. By May 24th, tens of millions of workers were on strike nationwide. France was in an ongoing and intense social unrest. Union leaders and the government knew in order to change, they must indicate change, since they were the core issue. On May 25th, 1968, a series of agreements called the Grenelle Agreements was created, an effort to compromise with rioters and followers alike. The people rejected the agreements and were still eager to resist. Charles de Gaulle simply fled France to Baden-Baden in Germany, in response leaving Prime Minister Georges Pompidou in charge. France was on the brink of war as each day, even an hour went by. Pompidou called for an armored gendarmerie of 1,000 men on the outskirts of France in hopes of containing rioters. With Pompidou in charge of France ultimately was met with economic insufficiency. Other government figures tried their best to negotiate with the local levels to figure out what they can do realistically to change in order to get protesters to stop. The strikes continued for at least another 3 weeks, but slowly burnt out until they were driven to an end in late June. Workers went back to their jobs since they would not be able to support themselves if they kept ignoring their work, but they did so with a lingering resentment and anger. As the strike slowly ended, Charles de Gaulle returned and called for a new election of parliament on May 30th, hoping to satisfy protesters. The re-election was basically anticlimactic, resulting in a minority of the party of de Gaulle got the majority of the seats in the new parliament. Although the Grenelle agreements were never actually signed, some of the major aspects of them were kept agreed upon. There was a 35% raise in minimum wage, 10% raise in overall wage, and a 40-hour work week. 6 months later, the Sorbonne became 13 smaller universities to handle the issue of student overcrowding. These justices were small but impactful nevertheless. Even to this day, this movement continues to inspire people who are seeking change in France and nationwide. The strike helped and continues to help youth alike recognize their voice in the world. The May 1968 protest shows students and workers today the importance of speaking up for yourself and what you think is right. This protest inspired people around the world for social justice, education reforms, and greater individual justice. Our voices are our most powerful tool to create a society where people are proud to call their home.